A silent civil war has begun behind the thick walls of the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin is throwing his most trusted generals and high-ranking officials into prison one by one. For over 20 years, Putin had managed the oligarchs, generals, and intelligence chiefs with a delicate balance. The glue holding this system together was turning a blind eye to corruption in exchange for loyalty. We are talking about a toxic but stable equilibrium where everyone got their share, everyone knew each other's secrets, but no one dared to sink the ship. However, the war in Ukraine shattered this structure. Over 1 million Russian soldiers were buried in the ground or turned into ghosts with no return. Tanks, armored vehicles, radar towers, fighter jets. Years of accumulation, billions of dollars worth of technology, mixed with Ukraine's rubble, melted away in black smoke. But this war was lost not only on the silent soil of the front lines, but also in the marble halls beneath the Kremlin. For Russia's lifeblood, its economy, is quietly bleeding just like its army. International sanctions are like invisible daggers piercing Moscow's veins. Energy exports have been restricted, SWIFT access cut off, and Russia has been excluded from the global banking system. The National Wealth Fund, once Putin's survival insurance, is rapidly dwindling. Reserves have evaporated. The ruble has lost its value. There is no longer any guarantee in the eyes of either the people at home or investors abroad. Large-scale construction projects across the country have been left to rot in planning files. The dams, highways and airports that once rose as the pride of the Soviet Union now exist only on paper. From Siberia to Volgograd, all subcontractors are on the verge of collapse. The state cannot pay. The tender system has been completely paralyzed due to corruption and insufficient funds. The financial sector is also slowly being dragged to the brink of bankruptcy. Giant financial institutions such as VTB, Sberbank, and Gazprombank are reeling from unrepayable loans. Mortgage loans are not being repaid, and small and medium-sized businesses are going bankrupt. Chain defaults are beating like the last pulse in the heart of the economy. Slow, irregular, deadly. Market shelves are full, but there is no purchasing power. People are struggling to even access basic food. Inflation is no longer just an economic statistic, it is a way of life. Every morning, millions of Russian citizens wake up trying to fearfully predict the price of tomatoes, bread, a liter of milk. And this crisis has hit not only the people, but also the Kremlin's richest children. Billions of dollars in oligarch assets smuggled abroad have been seized. Mansions in London, yachts on the Côte d'Azur, bank accounts in Geneva. All are now frozen, locked up, severing the Kremlin's last remaining ties to the outside world. Investor confidence has plummeted and foreign trade partners have turned their backs one by one. Russia has become isolated on the world stage. The number of leaders willing to shake Vladimir Putin's hand can now be counted on one hand. And those fingers are mostly totalitarian allies like North Korea and China. All of this has pitted the power groups within the Kremlin against each other. As the pie shrinks, the only way to survive is to eliminate those around you. The Ministry of Defense, the FSB, and the National Guard, once considered Putin's most unshakable strongholds, have now become hunting grounds. Since the beginning of 2025, corruption cases have been opened against at least 99 high-ranking officials, generals, and regional deputies. This means an average of 14 new cases per month. And this number has gone down in the records as a record for the last 10 years. The first step in understanding this major purge is to examine corruption, which has become the Kremlin's sharpest weapon, and how this weapon has been turned into an instrument of power. In Russia, corruption is not so much a crime as it is the system itself. The vertical power structure Putin has built is based on a pyramid where loyalty is bought with bribes and privileges. In this system, everyone from the traffic cop at the bottom to the general at the top uses their position for personal enrichment and passes on a portion of their spoils to the next level up in the pyramid. This is an unwritten rule that ensures the system runs smoothly. That is why the charge of corruption is the Kremlin's most powerful weapon. Because in this system, everyone, without exception, is guilty. Everyone has a weakness, hidden assets, or illegal deals. This gives Putin and his closest executioners the ability to eliminate anyone they want, at any time, under a completely legal guise. The operations launched today are not a clean-up operation, but a political purge. The goal is not to rid Russia of corruption, it is to eliminate figures whose loyalty to Putin is questioned, who have failed on the front lines, or who have sided with the wrong faction in the Kremlin's power struggle. Ironically, the targets of this purge are the Siloviki, the security and law enforcement bureaucracy, which are the regime's most fundamental pillars. generals in the Defense Ministry, colonels in the FSB, commissioners in the Interior Ministry. These institutions, once the unshakable guardians of Putin's power, are now being hunted down one by one from within. Behind this purge lies an increasingly heated factional war within the Kremlin. On one side are the old guard who rose to power with Putin, amassing enormous fortunes in the chaotic environment of the 1990s and 2000s. For this group, corruption is a right they have earned. On the other side is a younger, more ruthless, and more technocratic Siloviki group that has come to the fore with the war. This new generation views the old guard's lavish lifestyle and reckless corruption as a weakness, a betrayal in wartime. To them, it is unacceptable that billions of rubles that should have been sent to the army are being spent on generals' palaces on the Black Sea coast or their mistresses' luxury cars. The conflict between these two groups, with Putin as the arbiter, has turned into a bloody purge. Putin is using this war both to consolidate his own power and to create scapegoats for failures at the front. When this abstract analysis is fleshed out with names and stories, the gravity of the situation becomes clearer. Recent events seem to have come straight out of a thriller novel. The steel line that Russia has been trying to build on the Ukrainian border has torn apart not only the front line but also the state itself. And this destruction was symbolized by the death of former Transport Minister Roman Starovoyt. According to official records, it was a suicide. But in the corridors of the Kremlin, this suicide was not just that of a man. It was the suicide of the regime's internal cohesion, its security architecture, and its corrupt chain of loyalty. Starovoyt was responsible for the fortification systems along the Ukrainian border, which Putin had touted as his new Iron Curtain. It was a project worth billions of rubles, presented as a move to redefine Russia's military prestige, geopolitical borders, and internal security. However, this massive budget quickly became the first building block of personal wealth empires. The amount of money Starovoyt embezzled was enough to make even Moscow squint. And finally, death came. But what really shook the public was that this death was not an isolated case. On the same day, 42-year-old bureaucrat Andrei Kornaichuk, who worked directly under Starovoyt, also died. Cause of death: acute heart failure. What a coincidence. In Putin's Russia, hearts seemed to stop at the drop of a hat. As the net of investigations widened, it spread like a bloody stain across the political map. Former Tambov governor Maxim Yegorov was arrested on charges of large-scale bribery. It was alleged that Yegorov distributed public funds to contractors in regional infrastructure projects and quietly pocketed his share. Meanwhile, corruption was also bubbling up in the capital, Moscow. Alexei Soshnikov, once a rising star in Moscow, was now in the spotlight for embezzlement charges from the Belgorod construction department. Along with him, not only municipal officials but also private sector players such as Novosibirsk businessman Sergei Petryakov were implicated in the chain of corruption. This was no longer a regime crisis. It was sabotage perpetrated by the system against itself. Another name caught in the tightening noose was Rustem Zaynulin, deputy governor of Belgorod. He was detained on charges of fraud and using public funds for personal gain. Then we witnessed the same scenario in Novgorod. On July 22nd, the region's transport minister Konstantin Kuranov was arrested as part of a bribery investigation, followed 4 days later by his deputy Stanislav Shultsev. This chain of corruption, spreading from one region to another, was not cracking the stone structures of the Russian state, but its very backbone. But the real big earthquakes hit the military front. Former Deputy Defense Minister Dmitry Bulgakov was accused of embezzling a full 1.3 billion rubles. Bulgakov's career had been as the mastermind managing the Russian army's logistical arteries. But after the supply disasters in the Ukraine war, it became clear that this mastermind was riddled with tumors. Immediately afterwards, former Defense Ministry personnel chief Yuri Kuznetsov was accused of setting up a bribery network while in office. A raid on his home uncovered 100 million rubles in cash and a large amount of luxury property. It was no longer a matter of individual greed, but of a systemic institutional plunder. Major General Valery Muminjanov was arrested for corruption in the procurement of fortification materials and military equipment while serving in the Leningrad military district. This development confirmed that even the defense systems in the northwest were built with rotten bricks, and the next domino to fall was Lieutenant General Vadim Shamarin. As deputy chief of the General Staff, he was found to have directed billions of rubles in tenders for high-tech military systems. The court sentenced him to 7 years in prison. Lieutenant General Ivan Popov, who was also involved in the same case, received a 5-year sentence for systematically embezzling fortification materials sent for use in the occupied territories of Ukraine. However, the most shocking fall from grace among those closest to the Kremlin's inner circle came with Timur Ivanov. Known for his closeness to Putin and serving as deputy defense minister, Ivanov received a 13-year prison sentence for accepting large bribes in connection with construction activities in Zaporizhia. This major purge did not just end the careers or lives of a few generals. It triggered a chain reaction that dynamited the foundations of Russia's state structure, inflicting deep and lasting wounds militarily, politically, and socially. The most devastating effect on the ground could be called command paralysis. In an environment where generals and officers constantly lived in fear of arrest, dismissal, or worse, falling out of a window, no one dared to take initiative. Taking risks, trying new tactics, or taking responsibility for a defeat now meant career suicide, even literal suicide. This situation transformed the Russian army into an extremely rigid, predictable, and slow-moving structure. Commanders came to wait for approval from Moscow even for the smallest decisions. This created a fatal disadvantage for them against Ukraine's more flexible, faster, and more creative command structure. Moreover, the purge of experienced commanders led to their replacement with younger, more loyal but far less experienced figures. Absolute loyalty replaced merit. These new commanders were adept at telling Putin what he wanted to hear, but they were novices at managing complex military operations. This strategic blindness led to an increase in tactical errors that cost the lives of thousands of soldiers on the front lines. The army became a massive body that had lost its brain and moved only by brute force. Politically, this purge may seem at first glance to have strengthened Putin's power. He was eliminating his rivals and establishing absolute control. However, this is a deceptive show of strength. In reality, Putin is dismantling the very pillars on which his power rests, the Siloviki. The security bureaucracy that has protected him for 20 years, guaranteeing his power, has now turned into a swamp of fear and insecurity. Generals are informing on each other, intelligence units are plotting against each other. This situation is making Putin an increasingly lonely and isolated figure in the Kremlin. He is surrounded by sycophantic and cowardly advisors who only tell him what he wants to hear. The flow of real information has been cut off. This is the most dangerous trap a dictator can fall into. He becomes a prisoner of his own propaganda and loses touch with reality. While Putin believes everything is under control, he is actually cutting the legs off his own throne with his own hands. The vertical power structure is no longer a solid edifice, but a wreckage full of cracks that could collapse at any moment. For ordinary Russian citizens, this wave of purges presents a confusing and worrying picture. Although state television presents it as a clean-up against traitors and bribe takers, the high number of arrests and the fact that these people were heroes yesterday and are traitors today is fundamentally undermining the people's trust in the state. Putin had an unwritten contract with the Russian people. Don't get involved in politics, and I'll provide you with stability and security. However, this purge has shattered the image of stability. If even top generals and ministers are not safe, how can ordinary citizens feel secure? The economic burden of the war, mounting losses, and now this chaos at the top of the state are spreading the feeling that Putin's contract is no longer valid. While this may not immediately lead to an uprising, it deepens the anger, disappointment, and cynicism building up within society. This is a silent but deadly poison that slowly erodes the regime's legitimacy. Ultimately, what is happening behind the Kremlin walls is much more than a simple power struggle. It is a process of self-destruction triggered by the pressure of the war in Ukraine. In his efforts to secure absolute control and shift the blame for failures onto others, Putin is dismantling the structure he has built over the past 20 years with his own hands. Every general purged is an experience lost to the regime. Every official imprisoned is a link severed from the system. Every colonel who falls out the window is a seed of fear spread through the Kremlin corridors. This massive purge is not a sign of Putin's strength, but proof of his greatest weakness and paranoia. A leader who fears his own generals, his own intelligence chiefs, his own shadow, cannot lead his country to victory. On the contrary, he drags his country with him into an abyss of uncertainty and chaos. History is full of stories of leaders who devoured their own revolution. Stalin's Great Purge left the Soviet army leaderless on the eve of World War II and cost millions of lives. Today, the modern purge initiated by Putin may have brought Russia to the brink of a similar darkness. The rebellion in the palace may appear to have been suppressed, but in reality, it may be only the first spark of a larger fire spreading across the entire country. The walls of the Kremlin now conceal not only power, but also a growing fear, insecurity, and the echoes of collapse. This dark picture shows us that Russia's war in Ukraine is being lost not only on the battlefields but also in the corridors of the Kremlin. Corruption is not just an economic crime, it is a silent but devastating sign of a regime rotting from within. If you also want to take a look behind the scenes of the war, the inner workings of power, and the points where global balances are cracking with this kind of in-depth analysis, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Your comments and contributions to this video and sharing your thoughts are very valuable to us. Write your thoughts below, let your voice be heard in this discussion. Don't forget to leave a like and share this video with friends who you think will find it interesting. See you again in new videos. Stay tuned, stay well.